Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and wherever you are in the world, welcome to episode number 2 of How to Get the Most Out of a Book. And today, we're going to focus on how to take better notes when you're reading a book. Now, here's my situation. I took 6 months off of college for me just to read whatever I want. So in a sense, I'm living in paradise right now. But in another sense, right now I'm going through a painstaking process of digging through some of the fattest books in Western philosophy just on my own. And I'm really enjoying this process of teaching myself everything that I need to know before I do postgrad research. So here in this video, I want to show you guys how I take notes when I'm going through all these complicated stuff in my spare time. And I just want to go through these tips step by step and sort of make it very rapid fire, make it very actionable. So without further ado, here's step number 1. Number 1, you really want to find a quiet reading corner. And when you're reading the book, bring a notepad with you. In episode number 1 of How to Get the Most Out of a Book, I talked about taking notes in the margins. And then later on, I kind of realized it's way more efficient to have an organized pile of notes instead of just having these notes scattered in your book everywhere. So instead of having a conversation with the author on the book itself, you are going to have that conversation in your notepad with the author as you're reading the book. Step number 2, which I think is the most important step, you want to take notes as you're reading the book. This is really important. Instead of waiting for yourself to finish an entire chapter and then take notes afterwards, because you tend to forget a lot of the spontaneous insights that you'll have when you're reading a chapter. As soon as you have an insight, jot it down. As soon as you have a revelation here and there when you're reading a paragraph or two, jot them down straight away. It kind of reminds me of how Kurt Vonnegut wrote novels, where he'd revise the same page 20 times before he'd move on to the next. And even though it took him longer to write 2 to 3 pages compared to other writers, but at the end of that entire process, he'd have a complete novel that doesn't need any more revisions. And for you, even though reading a chapter in this fashion, where you have to pause every 2-3 paragraphs to take some notes down, even though it takes longer for you, in the moment, by the time you finish that chapter, you'd have all of these summary notes. So you, in a sense, don't have to read the chapter ever again, and you just have to look over your notes to get the gist of the chapter. And do remember to do a broad inspectional reading before you start the note-taking process to sort of see how the chapter is structured, how the arguments are structured, and then you can go in really deep to apply this note-taking process page by page. I've already covered inspectional reading in part number 1, so here is part number 1 somewhere on the screen. Click it, watch it, and then come back here. And step number 3 here has to do with the structure of your notes. I know everyone's got their pet favorite note-taking system, the Cornell method, the flow method, the whatever method, the bullet point method, but sometimes simplicity is absolutely everything. And personally, I like to structure my notes in terms of questions and concepts. Notice that whenever you're reading a nonfiction book, or whenever you're reading a book that's trying to communicate some insights to you, the author really had to go out of his way to structure the book in a very coherent and logical way. And you, as the reader, your job is to hunt for the author's propositions, arguments, and the sort of evidence that the author's using to back up these propositions and these arguments. I personally took some inspiration from Wittgenstein's tiny little book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, where each proposition is followed by explanations of the proposition in numbered remarks. So when I take my notes, as soon as I spot like an umbrella concept or a general argument or a thing that the author is trying to put forth, I tend to stop, identify the proposition or the argument, and label that thing as 1.0, and that's going to become the heading for the first chunk of notes. And the little bullet points that follow this general umbrella concepts are in a sense explanations and elaborations of this general concept. So in the end, you're going to end up with these notes structured under general concepts and arguments. And as you read along, you're going to gather more and more of these supporting arguments or auxiliary arguments and all of these little points to back up the general concept. And when you finish the entire chapter, you should end up with a pretty well-organized series of notes, all grouped under major concepts, questions, and major arguments and propositions. These notes are super easy to review, and you can add your own commentaries in these notes, and it provides a very good general overview of the entire chapter, and it provides your own interpretation of the chapter, so you don't actually have to reread the chapter ever again. You just have to read your notes and correct your understanding from there. That, in short, is how I currently take my notes on my Remarkable, or how I take my notes when I'm reading some pretty long and heavy treatises. Just a concluding remark before you go off to practice this note-taking technique. This technique is a little more difficult than the signposting technique that I introduced in episode number 1 of How to Get the Most Out of a Book, because, well, episode number 1 is kind of like a scaffold for you to get comfortable with identifying key arguments and big umbrella concepts. And the process of note-taking is really just you replicating the logical structure of the entire chapter while removing out a filler. So it does take a lot of practice. If you're a little shaky on the entire identifying arguments and proposition part, I'll probably make a whole separate video about that. Or you can just review part number 1 and practice the signposting technique first before you jump into this read along and take notes along your reading sort of thing. Nevertheless, very rapid fire today. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and leave me a comment down below. And by the way, right now I'm producing a lot of content, a lot of written content, and a lot of newsletters on A Mug of Insight, which is a newsletter that I recently launched. So if you want insights into what I've been reading recently and some of the wacky thoughts I've been having recently, right now I'm sending out a lot of these really tiny newsletters or mugs of insights to subscribers' emails. Anyway, RC Waldun here. Happy reading, happy note-taking, and I will see you soon with more. Take care and goodbye.